Welcome back to Clipboard Electronics. Today on the clipboard I've got my ATTiny ISP. Now I was using this to program some ATTiny 85s here for a clock module project which I'm working on for a retro computing setup. And I had a little bit of trouble getting this to work, so I want to just go over how I set it up and what I do exactly to get the programs onto my ATTiny 85. Now, the first thing that I suggest you do is go ahead and build a separate setup just for this if you have a spare Arduino and everything you need. Because I was trying to do this on the middle of a breadboard where I was in the middle of something else, and that just wasn't working. So I strongly suggest setting up a separate piece and just doing this by itself because it makes it a lot easier to get everything straight. The second problem that I ran into was you apparently can't do this with other Arduinos. You have to use the Uno, or in this case, an Uno clone. I tried to do this for a while with an Arduino Micro, and it just wasn't working. Now the wiring here is critical, so I wanted to go over that in detail. I've got a capacitor plugged directly into the Arduino. The capacitor goes from the ground pin here over to the Arduino's reset pin, and if you use an electrolytic capacitor like this, make sure you get it on the right way. The negative pole will go into the ground pin and the positive will go into the reset. Okay, it's very important that you get the wiring for this exactly right. I had some trouble getting it straight. If you get some of these switched around, it just won't work. So double check and triple check these connections if you have any issues. One thing that really helped me was I wrote down the chip orientation next to my breadboard so that it's easier to check if I've got things in the right spot. I found that when I had this on a separate piece of paper, I was getting that piece of paper turned around and stuff, and I was getting these backwards. Now, the first two are easy. They're just power and ground for the chips. So you take the power from the 5-volt pin on the Arduino, and you go over here to VCC of the chip, which is pin 8. Take ground as well over here to the ground of the chip, which is pin 4. Now it's really important not to get these communication lines mixed up. They all come from this rail over here on the Arduino, pin 13, 12, 11, and 10. And depending on which chip diagrams you're looking at, the pin numbers can be kind of confusing because the programming pin numbers are different than the chip pinout numbers. So the white wire here goes from pin 13 to SCK, which is pin 7 on the ATTiny. 12, which is the blue wire here, goes to MISO, which is pin 6 on the ATTiny. 11 from the Arduino, which is the gray wire, goes to MOSI, which is pin 5 on the ATTiny there. The last one is the reset line, which goes from pin 10, it's the brown wire, over to reset of the ATTiny, which is pin 1, right next to the dot. If any of these wires are wrong, obviously it won't work. So double and triple check that. Make sure you've got the orientation right here, and design a way to make sure that you get the legs of the chip in the right place as well. In my case, I just used the last row of holes on the breadboard, and that way it's easy to get it in the right row. So to get started programming your ATTiny first open up your Arduino IDE. Go into the Preferences screen and fill in the link that I will put into the video description into this box here where it says Additional Boards Manager URLs. Click OK on that, and then go into your Tools, Board, and click on Boards Manager. Go all the way down to the bottom in this window and you should see ATTiny. If it's not installed, go ahead and install it, or update it if it is installed. Then you can close the Boards Manager. After you do that, when you go into your list of boards here, you should see the ATTiny boards all the way at the bottom. Now the next thing you need to do is set up your Arduino as an ISP. So go into your examples here, find Arduino ISP, and load that sketch, Arduino ISP. Then go into your tools and select your Arduino board in the boards list. The next thing you'll need to do is plug in your Arduino to your computer. And temporarily remove this capacitor. This next step will not work with this capacitor in place, so remove that. Then you can upload your sketch to the Arduino Uno. There we go. Then reinsert the capacitor into your Arduino. Remember, it goes from ground to reset. Don't get it backwards. Now go into your Tools menu and select the ATTiny board that you're using. In my case, it's the ATTiny 85. Then go into your Tools and select these options here. In the processor, it needs to be ATTiny 85 here. In the clock, I want to select internal. Now in my case, I'm using the 16 megahertz clock. So I'm going to select internal 16 megahertz here. Then I'm going to go down to the programmer and make sure I have Arduino as ISP selected. When you have all that set up, you can go down here to Burn Bootloader. Now you should see thank you here. You can check and make sure there weren't any errors. You can ignore this error here about BS2 signals not defined in the configuration file. That's fine. But you can see the bootloader has been updated. Now you can go in and create a sketch or load one that you will be putting onto the ATTiny itself. In my case, I have this sketch that I wrote for my clock module, and I'm going to upload that. I recheck because I did get a new window. I just recheck all these settings here. These are all fine. And then you want to select under Sketch, Upload Using Programmer. And you should see there we go, 864 bytes of flash verified, AVRD done. So that's really all there is to it. At that point, the ATTiny is programmed, and I can put it into my clock board, and it will run the clock. So after you're done doing that, you can take your ATTiny out of the programmer and put it back into whatever circuit it was intended for. In this case, I'm using it for a clock module. It's not quite finished yet. I'm missing a couple of parts right there. But this is a clock module for breadboard computers, similar to Ben Eater's 8-bit breadboard computer, which is a very good video series if you haven't watched it. But I'm going to use this to make computers with Z80 and 6502 processors, and this will be the testing clock, not the clock that I actually run with, but this will be the testing clock. And as you can see, if I apply some power to this, that even though I replaced the ATTiny that I was using before with the new one that I just programmed, it still works the same way. I'm getting my clock signal there with my variable output. So if you want to see how that project turns out, be sure to subscribe to Clipboard Electronics, because I will have a video series coming up about how to build a breadboard computing platform with a 6502 or Z80. I'm not sure which one yet. But thank you for watching Clipboard Electronics. Please post some comments if you have any questions about this process. I found it easy once I got everything straight, but it is a little bit complicated to get all the wiring correct and all the settings, and that capacitor business where the Arduino wouldn't program with that capacitor there, that tripped me up as well. So hopefully this helped and you can get your ATTinys programmed and start playing around with this wonderful little microcontroller.